The screen is black. The sound of a cold, lonely wind. A single low drum beat begins, like a distant heart. Imagine a force of nature, a storm on the horizon that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be negotiated with, and cannot be stopped. A storm that has swallowed empires and crushed cities that were said to be eternal. Now, imagine that storm has a name, Mehmed II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And it is coming for you. This is not a metaphor. In 1462, this was the reality for the tiny principality of Wallachia. An army of over 150,000 men, the most powerful and disciplined military machine on the planet, was crossing the Danube. They brought with them cannons that had shattered the 1,000-year-old walls of Constantinople, elite Janissary soldiers who were born and bred for war, and a leader who had never ever known true defeat. And what stood in their way? A prince named Vlad III, a man with a force of barely 30,000 peasants, farmers, and mercenaries, a kingdom so small it was a footnote on the maps of Europe. Logic, history, and God himself seemed to dictate that Wallachia would be annihilated, that its people would be slaughtered or enslaved, its name erased from memory. But Vlad had a different plan. He knew he could not defeat the storm. So, he decided to become something worse. He would not fight a war of swords and shields. He would orchestrate a campaign of such calculated, soul-shattering terror that it would break the mind of the invincible conqueror. This is not a story about a battle for land. This is the story of a war for the human soul, and how one man, backed into a corner, chose to embrace utter darkness to save his people from it. By the end of this, you will not just know what happened, you will understand the terrifying power of fear itself. The seeds of this conflict were sown not on a battlefield, but in a gilded cage. To understand the man who would become Vlad the Impaler, you must first understand the boy he was. From the tender age of 11, Vlad and his younger brother Radu lived as political hostages in the Ottoman court. They were insurance, a guarantee of their father's loyalty to the Sultan, while Radu, handsome and charming, adapted to his new life, even befriending the young Prince Mehmed. Vlad festered. He was quiet, he watched, he learned. He saw the intricate clockwork of the Ottoman military, memorizing guard rotations and command structures. He perfected his Turkish until he spoke it without a trace of a foreign accent. He studied their laws, their customs, and most importantly, their fears. Every polite smile he was forced to give, every subtle humiliation, every moment of utter powerlessness was meticulously filed away in his memory. It was not a childhood, it was an education in the anatomy of an empire. He was learning, piece by piece, how to dismantle the machine from the inside. 2 decades later, the student was ready to test his lessons. In 1459, Sultan Mehmed II, now the celebrated conqueror of Constantinople, sent envoys to Vlad's capital of Targoviste. Their demands were simple: an overdue tribute of 10,000 gold ducats, and a levy of 500 Wallachian boys to be ripped from their families and forged into janissaries. It was a standard imperial demand. But Vlad was no standard prince. He invited the envoys to a feast. When they refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing religious protocol, Vlad's response was swift and horrifying. He praised their devotion and offered to strengthen it. On his command, soldiers seized the envoys and nailed their turbans directly to their skulls. Their screams were a declaration of war. It was an act of calculated brutality, a message sent in a language of pain that Vlad knew Mehmed would understand perfectly. Wallachia would not bow. Mehmed, conqueror of the unconquerable, was insulted but not concerned. This upstart prince was a nuisance, a rabid dog to be put down. The Sultan, a strategic genius who at 21 had toppled an empire that had stood for a millennium, began preparations. He assembled a force that was not merely an army, but an instrument of annihilation. Estimates vary, but even the most conservative placed the Ottoman force at 100,000 men, with some sources claiming up to 300,000. It included at least 20,000 janissaries, the elite slave soldiers who knew no fear and gave no quarter. The army was a rolling city, complete with 120 massive cannons, a siege train that could level any fortress, and a supply line that seemed endless. As this apocalyptic tide rolled towards the Danube in the spring of 1462, the world held its breath. No one gave Wallachia a chance. But they didn't know Vlad. They didn't know about his education in darkness. Against this behemoth, Vlad's 30,000 men seemed like a tragic afterthought. But Vlad understood a fundamental weakness of all great armies: they have a great appetite. The Ottoman strategy relied on living off the conquered land. So Vlad made the land itself his first weapon. He gave an order that would echo through history: burn it all. Every village in the path of the Ottoman advance was systematically evacuated and turned to ash. Granaries were torched, fields were salted, and wells were poisoned, many filled with the corpses of animals to ensure the water would spread disease. The landscape was transformed into a desolate, empty wasteland. It was not just a scorched earth policy, it was psychological warfare. An Ottoman soldier marching into Wallachia would find no food, no water, no shelter. Only ghost towns and the unnerving silence of a land that had chosen to commit suicide rather than be conquered. But Vlad's strategy was more diabolical still. He knew from his years in captivity about the brutal reality of camp hygiene in a massive army. He unleashed a second invisible wave of attack. He gathered his own peasants who were dying from plague, dysentery, and other sicknesses. Dressed in Ottoman clothing and speaking perfect Turkish, these plague carriers slipped into the sprawling enemy camp. They were welcomed as fellow Muslims, sharing water skins, food, and stories. Within days, a hidden enemy began to ravage the Ottoman ranks. Fever and dysentery spread like wildfire, a silent, relentless assault that no armor could stop. As the Ottoman army pushed deeper into the hostile, empty landscape, their morale began to fray. The land was empty, but it felt watchful. Then the night attacks began. It was a new kind of warfare, not battles, but assassinations. Small, ghostly bands of Wallachian horsemen would emerge from the forests. Sentries would vanish from their posts with no more than a muffled gasp. Patrols would ride into a ravine and never be seen again, their horses screaming as they fell into camouflaged pits lined with sharpened stakes. By dawn, dozens would be dead or missing. No bodies of the attackers were ever found. They struck and vanished, leaving only arrows, traps, and a paralyzing growing fear. An Ottoman chronicler wrote, "The land itself fights us. We see no enemy army, yet we are dying. It is as if the Christians have made a pact with devils." Vlad's network of spies, including former janissaries who had escaped service, moved through the Ottoman camp like wraiths. They gathered intelligence, guard rotations, password patterns, the precise location of supply wagons and officer tents. Every strike was surgical. One night, a raid would target the gunpowder wagons. The next, it would be the officers' quarters. The next, the horse lines. Vlad wasn't trying to defeat the army in these raids. He was dissecting it. He was weakening its body, fraying its nerves, and preparing its mind for the true horror that was yet to come. On the night of June 16th, the Ottoman army camped near Targoviste. They were exhausted, sick, and terrified, but they were still a vastly superior force. Vlad knew his guerrilla tactics could not last forever. He needed something decisive, a single blow that would shatter the army's will to fight. He needed to strike at its heart. What happened next was an act of almost unbelievable audacity. To verify the intelligence his spies had gathered, Vlad decided he had to see the camp with his own eyes. Disguised as a Turkish merchant, his face obscured by a low hood, the Prince of Wallachia personally infiltrated the camp of 150,000 men who were there to kill him. His flawless Turkish allowed him to move through the sprawling chaos, a ghost observing his own doom. He paced the distances between tents, he noted the patterns of the guards, and he confirmed the location of the most important target, the opulent three-crescent pavilion that marked the command tent of Sultan Mehmed himself. He had found the serpent's head. He returned to his own camp and gathered 7,000 of his most loyal cavalry. It was, by all accounts, a suicide mission. But Vlad armed them with more than just courage, he armed them with intelligence. They would not charge blindly. They would follow precise paths to exact targets. The goal wasn't to fight 150,000 men, it was to make 150,000 men fight each other. As midnight approached, the attack began not with a battle cry, but with a whisper. Vlad's Turkish-speaking scouts slipped past the perimeter guards, using the very passwords he had learned hours earlier. They moved silently to the gunpowder wagons, setting slow-burning fuses. They cut the tethers of war horses, setting them loose. Then, at exactly 1 a.m., from 7 different directions simultaneously, 7,000 horsemen erupted from the darkness. The perimeter guards died before they could even raise an alarm. Moments later, the gunpowder wagons exploded, turning the night sky into a pulsating, hellish dawn. The shockwave and fireballs plunged the camp into pure chaos. Ottomans, dazed and confused, stumbled from their tents straight into the lances of the Wallachians. But the true genius of the attack was auditory. The Wallachian attackers, all screaming in perfect Turkish, shouted contradictory orders. The Christians are attacking from the east. All troops to the east. The Sultan's tent is under siege. Defend the center. In the pitch-black, fire-strafed pandemonium, Ottoman soldiers could not distinguish friend from foe. A unit of Janissaries rushing to defend their sultan would collide with a unit of Sipahi cavalry responding to a different alarm, and in the confusion, they would begin butchering each other. The camp became a vortex of friendly fire. Orders were screamed and immediately contradicted. Tents collapsed on their occupants. Stampeding horses trampled everything in their path. Vlad had turned the army's greatest strength, its size, into its most fatal weakness. He himself led a hand-picked force of 200 riders on a desperate charge toward Mehmed's pavilion. This was the ultimate prize. Kill the Sultan, and the invasion would die with him. They carved a bloody path through the confusion, their eyes fixed on the gleaming golden crescents of the royal tent. They burst inside, swords and lances ready for the killing blow. But the tent was occupied only by the terrified Grand Vizier. Mehmed, a paranoid and experienced campaigner, had developed a habit of switching his tent at the last minute. The one night it mattered most, the habit had saved his life. The moment was lost. Elite Janissaries, finally organizing, formed a wall of steel and converged on the royal pavilion. Vlad had seconds to make a choice. He sounded the retreat. The horns blared, and as quickly as they had appeared, the Wallachian cavalry vanished back into the shadows they came from. Dawn on June 17th revealed a scene from hell. At least 15,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead. Thousands more were wounded. The camp, once a model of military order, was a smoldering apocalyptic ruin. The army's morale was not just broken, it was gone. But Mehmed was alive, and he was furious. In a display of iron will, he refused to retreat. He understood the game now. Vlad had hurt him badly but had failed in his ultimate objective. The Ottoman army, though battered, still vastly outnumbered the Wallachians. He would force a conventional battle, where numbers would crush spirit. He gave the order, an immediate, forced march on Targoviste. Crush the prince, burn his city, and end this nightmare. The Ottoman army, a death procession of exhausted and demoralized soldiers, stumbled forward. As they crested the final hill before the capital, the entire army shuddered to a halt. The men in the front ranks stood paralyzed, their faces masks of sheer horror. Hardened veterans who had seen the worst of warfare fell to their knees. Before them, stretching for nearly 3 kilometers in precise, geometric rows, was a forest of 20,000 stakes, and on each stake, impaled and rotting in the summer heat, was a body. The stench of decay was overwhelming, a physical wave that made men gag and weep. The air was thick with the drone of millions of flies, but it was the terrible, methodical artistry of the scene that shattered their minds. These were not random victims. The bodies were arranged by rank and origin. Vlad had impaled every Turkish prisoner he had taken: soldiers, scouts, tax collectors, sympathizers, 20,000 of them. He had created an amphitheater of death. And in the very center, on a stake taller than all the others, sat the preserved body of Hamza Pasha, Mehmed's trusted general and dear friend. He was positioned to face the approaching army, his dead eyes seeming to stare directly at the Sultan. It was a message of unimaginable cruelty, written in the flesh of a friend. This was not the chaotic brutality of a battlefield. This was the patient, deliberate work of a single, terrifying will. It was a statement: this is what it costs to conquer my land. This awaits every single one of you. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man whose name made kings tremble, rode forward alone. He looked upon this forest of the dead, upon the face of his impaled friend, and the will of an empire finally broke. Contemporary accounts say he whispered, "I cannot take the land from a man who does such things." He gave the order that his commanders could not believe: full retreat. It was not a retreat, it was a flight. The most powerful army in the world turned and ran, haunted by the image of that forest and harried every step of the way by Vlad's remaining horsemen, who continued to strike from the shadows, leaving fresh stakes as their calling cards. Vlad Dracula had won. He never defeated the Ottoman army. He couldn't. He defeated their will to fight. He built a fortress of pure terror in his enemy's mind, a barrier more effective than any castle wall. The story would become a legend, and the legend would become a myth. But the truth remains. In 1462, when faced with certain annihilation, one prince chose to become a monster, and in doing so, he saved his kingdom. History is not just written by the victors, it is written by those with the will to do the unthinkable. The story of Vlad the Impaler is a brutal reminder that sometimes the most effective weapon is not a sword, but an idea. If these are the kinds of stories that captivate you, the tales of history that are darker and more complex than any fiction, then make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. There are many more shadows to explore.